Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Today we're talking to Dr. Howard Ginsberg. He is a research ecologist with the USGS Eastern Ecological Science Center. Hi, Howie. Welcome to Backyard Ecology. Thank you for talking with us today.
Hi. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm excited about this topic because the reason I wanted to have you on today was you and some of your colleagues have been doing some really interesting research on ticks and Lyme disease. And before all of our listeners start to kind of look at me like I'm crazy and think I've just totally lost it for using tick research and interesting in the same sentence, trust me, this is pretty interesting stuff. I actually learned a whole lot reading the recent paper, which is why I wanted to talk to you and bring you on, because I think a lot of our listeners will do the same thing. But before we get into that, let's take a minute and just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, I'm a research scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey. I'm associated with the Eastern Ecological Science Center with the Maryland site, which is formerly Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. But I'm at a field station at the University of Rhode Island. So I'm up here in southern New England. And I've been working with national parks and other Department of Interior lands for a long time on various arthropods problems that are associated with. Worked on mosquito issues. And it was clear, the park I worked most with was Fire Island National Seashore, which is a barrier island off the south shore of Long Island in New York. And they have very large populations of salt marsh mosquitoes there and of ticks. I first started working there on the mosquitoes and realized that mosquitoes were not really posing much of a health threat to people visiting the park, but ticks did. So I talked to the Park Service people and switched over to working on ticks. So I've been working on ticks now since the mid-1980s.
And as someone who has always loved spending time in the outdoors and in nature myself, I know I've had to deal with my fair share of the ticks. I'd say more than my fair share of the ticks in some cases. And I'm sure many of our listeners can relate, which again is part of the reason why I wanted to have you on here, and that I really think that our listeners will find your work interesting. And of course, one of the reasons why ticks are such a concern for us is because of the diseases that some of them carry. And I know that, I don't know, I feel like there's almost more tick-borne diseases now than there was when I was growing up. And I don't know, is that just because I'm an adult now and so I'm more aware of diseases and tick-borne diseases, or are there actually more emerging?
Well, there actually are. Tick-borne diseases are actually increasing. A lot of them have been here, but part of the reason that they're increasing is that the physical environment has changed in much of the country, and especially in the northeastern U.S. in such a way that it's fostered increasing populations of ticks that turn out to be important for disease transmission. If you look back in the history of the Northeast, most of the forest was cleared with European settlement. Like in New York State, for example, where I've done some work, the peak of land cleared to create farms was in the 1880s. 75% of the state was farmland in the 1880s. Trees were used for firewood and to build homes. Deer were shot for food. And as farmers started moving to the Midwest in the late 1800s, then you had kind of second growth woodland increasing and deer populations increasing. And it turns out for the black-legged tick or deer tick, the one that transmits Lyme disease, the deer is the primary host of the adult stage of the tick. So you had a good habitat for the ticks. I mean, the immature ticks like to live in the woods in leaf litter and closed canopy woodlands, and the deer is the host for the adults. So you have a lot of deer, then you have a lot of ticks feeding on them, and a single female lays on average of about 1,500 eggs per female. So you have the recipe for a large increase in the tick population. So in the late 1800s, the best guess is that these ticks survived in little refugia and small habitats here and there, coastal islands, for example. And then when the deer population started increasing and you had this wonderful environment, which essentially, it had gone from a big primeval forest into essentially a dissected woodlands with lots of second growth woods and lots of food for deer. Mm-hmm. The population went shooting up all through the 1900s. And it was a perfect environment for these tick numbers to start increasing. So the black-legged ticks increased, the deer ticks increased, and they already had the Lyme disease spirochete. There are, for example, mouse skins that were collected on Cape Cod in the 1890s, where people have found the DNA of the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. So it was there, but it was very rare in those days, but it started increasing. And as of the 1970s, it started becoming very common. So this was a big increase. And now that brought people's attention to these ticks as carriers of disease. And as people looked, more and more pathogens became clear. So these pathogens were there, presumably, but they were very rare. And now they've become common. So that has been an increase in your lifetime. Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And I know we're going to talk more about the actual research article that recently came out by you and your colleagues in a few minutes. But when I was reading that article, one of the things that I realized was that there was a lot that I either didn't know about ticks or was incorrect in my thinking about ticks. I just didn't understand it. And as I was reading that article and realizing that, one of the other realizations I came up to was that some of that misinformation I had, or lack of information, either way, was really important to understanding disease transmission with the ticks. So I think before we actually get into the research itself, we need to step back a little bit and talk about some of that basic tick biology, life history and stuff, so that our readers can also better understand the research and some of its implications. So let's just kind of start at the beginning. How many different species of ticks are there in the Eastern US?
Well, in the Eastern US, there are 27 species of hard ticks. Worldwide basis, there are about 900 species of ticks, of which about 700 are hard ticks. The other major group are the soft ticks, which occur, there are a couple around here, but mostly they're in the West and in other parts of the world, most of the southern regions. In terms of disease in the Eastern US, 27 species east of the Mississippi, and 3 major species that are important for disease transmission. There's the black-legged tick, the one that transmits Lyme disease, and Lyme disease is the big one. It also transmits anaplasmosis, which is caused by a rickettsia, very small bacteria. Transmits babesiosis, which is caused by a small protozoan, a malaria-like disease. And it transmits Powassan virus, which is a fairly serious viral disease related to a tick-borne disease found in the old world. That's fortunately very rare, extremely rare. The others are not that rare, but much less common than Lyme disease. Lyme disease, if you look at vector-borne diseases worldwide, diseases carried by insects and ticks and other arthropods. The big ones are malaria and dengue fever, which are transmitted by mosquitoes, and they are tropical, very rare in temperate regions. In north temperate regions, tick-borne disease are far and away the most common, and Lyme disease is the most common worldwide, North America, Europe, Asia. In the United States, about 35 to 40,000 cases of Lyme disease are reported every year to the CDC. But they've done studies looking at the actual number, because not all cases are reported for a variety of reasons. The actual number is closer to 400,000 cases per year. So it's a fairly substantial disease burden in the United States. The other 2 ticks that transmit diseases in North America, the Lone Star tick, which is very common in the South, transmits a few species of Ehrlichia, which are rickettsia, small bacteria pathogens. Nowhere near as many, in a few thousand cases a year, as opposed to, are reported as opposed to 40,000 for Lyme disease. And the American dog tick, which transmits Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which is another rickettsial disease, maybe 5,500 cases a year reported to the CDC. That is mostly, we do get it up north, but not commonly. It is a belt from North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. That's where most of that disease is transmitted. But again, it's not rare, but much, much, much less common than Lyme disease. Lyme disease is a big one. And Lyme disease is predominantly in the northern states, the Northeast and northern Midwest. I mean, you do have it in the South, but it's relatively rare down there.
Yeah, the ones that we hear most about in Kentucky are alpha-gal, the meat allergy now.
Right.
And then also there's a few others.
Yeah, now alpha-gal is transmitted by the Lone Star. It's caused by the Lone Star tick bite. And that's when I said transmits ehrlichiosis. Well, Ehrlichia is a pathogen. Alpha-gal is not a pathogen. It's something that's a saliva that induces an immune response in people such that susceptible people have an allergic response to red meat. Yeah, that does occur. Lone Star ticks are, if you look historically, that tick was highly abundant from central New Jersey south, and very common in the southeast, but it's been moving north. I started work on ticks on Fire Island National Seashore, that national park, Long Island, in the mid 1980s. And when I first started working on it, there were very few Lone Star ticks. I encountered a few every year. But by the time I was done with that study, by the early 1990s, it was the most common tick on Fire Island. So it's really expanding north. We've had it, there's one island in Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island where it's been there since 1990 at least, but we're starting to see it now on the mainland. So that tick does seem to be spreading northward, and that might be climate change related. 100% sure, but that's plausible.
Okay, I've got to ask.
Yeah.
How are ticks spreading? I mean, is it just a very gradual increase of the range expansion, or are they moving like on the deer and stuff? I mean, we don't have great tick migrations like we have bird migrations and stuff.
As far as we know, all of the above. A lot of these ticks in the immature stages are very common on birds, including migratory birds. The black-legged ticks are, Lone Star ticks are, and so they move. One of the studies we did in Fire Island in the 1990s, we were catching birds to see how important birds were as hosts for the ticks. And we found all kinds of ticks on those birds, including some southern species that didn't exist in the north. So the answer to your question is both ways. I mean, they do move incrementally on deer and mice and things as they move, but they also have a long distance movement on migratory birds and on people. People camp in the south, they get some ticks on their vehicle and they move north. Both ways, most likely, but they won't establish population in the north unless the environment is permissible for them to establish. And with climate change, more and more environments in northern climates are appropriate for southern ticks. And so I'm guessing if you look at spread of the black-legged tick into Canada, there's good evidence that it's spread across Great Lakes on birds into parts of Canada. And in the case of the Lone Star tick, we know that it moves on birds, but it's only recently that there's been an established population in Connecticut, for example, and now there's evidence in Rhode Island as well. So it seems to be moving north. And birds may or may not have played a role in that. We don't know, but probably both of those methods account for the spread.
And because of what you just said, we're jumping right into a question I was going to ask later, because this is one of the things I found so fascinating about the research paper. What are all the hosts that some of these ticks that, like the deer tick or blackleg tick, same species, just two different names. I'm going to use deer tick more because that's what I'm used to calling.
That's more of a commonly used name, but black-legged tick is kind of, the Entomological Society of America has official common names, and that's the one they use. So I'll stick with
that makes sense.
that is the deer tick, same tick.
Okay. And the Lone Star tick and the dog tick. What are the hosts for those?
Well, first, let me talk about the tick life cycle, because hosts change through the life cycle. Ticks lay eggs. The eggs hatch out from the larvae. Larvae are really tiny. Now, you really have to look hard to see them. They're visible to the naked eye, but they're really tiny. And for most diseases, most pathogens, they're not infected. There are a few that are passed from mother to offspring, but Lyme disease is not for the most part. So the larvae are not infected. They're really tiny, large numbers. They seek a host, engorge, drop off, molt to the nymphal stage, which is the second immature stage. A little bit larger, still very small, but they've fed one, so they might be infected. In fact, the nymphal stage is the one responsible for most human cases of Lyme disease. In the Northeast, typically about a quarter of them are infected, so it's a high infection rate. Mm-hmm. Then they take a blood meal, molt to the adult stage, and the adult then it In the Northeast, maybe 40 or 50% of the adults are infected. But the adults are larger and easier to see, and they tend to be out starting in October and through the winter. So people are wearing long clothes, long pants, long sleeves. They see them and flip them off. So there's a lot less Lyme disease from adults, even though a lot of them are infected. The nymphs are out, right? They're in the leaf litter, in the woods. They're out in June, July, and all people are out there in shorts and flip-flops. So that's when people are exposed to Lyme disease. Now that's a 3-host tick because each stage is on a different animal. And if you look at the animals they feed on, the larvae and nymphs feed on almost anything, almost any mammal, birds, reptiles, lizards in particular. Don't like snakes for some reason. But the adults are primarily on large mammals. Adults primarily on deer or on bear in the northern Midwest, but deer primarily, white-tailed deer is the primary host for the adult stage of the tick. There are some other ticks that stay on one host throughout their life. They're called one-host ticks. Like the winter tick you may have heard of, that's on moose up in Canada. That's a Dermacentra albopictus. That the larvae are free living in the fall. They find an ungulate like a deer or a moose to feed on, and they will stay on that same animal while they molt all through their life. So there are some one-host ticks, but the ones that are more important for disease transmission tend to be these 3-host ticks because they feed on one host, can pick up a pathogen like the Lyme disease bacterium, Borrelia burgdorferi, and then they can, they molt, then they can feed on something else like a person and maybe transmit the pathogen. So in terms of what animals they feed on, so in terms of the deer tick or the black-legged tick, larvae and nymphs are very broad in their host range, feed on a wide variety of things, reptiles, mammals, and birds. Adults tend to be on large mammals. In the case of the Lone Star tick, they tend to not be so much on small mammals. The immatures are common on birds and on medium and large mammals. They like deer, immatures like deer as well. Adults predominantly on deer, but they'll go on large birds like wild turkeys, you get adults on. So that's Lone Star ticks. The American dog tick, when the carries recognized spotted fever, the immatures are on small mammals. You get them on mice and stuff and voles. They don't bite humans. The adults, mostly on medium-sized mammals, like raccoons, things like that, but they will also bite humans, and that's when you get Rocky Mountain spotted fever transmitted. Fortunately, relatively rare.
Yeah, I just find that fascinating because I've always thought of ticks as being on mammals, all different sized mammals, but just mammals. I definitely never thought about the same ticks that bite us being on birds at different stages. And I only first got introduced to even the idea of ticks being on reptiles and skinks back, it's probably been about 10 years ago. I was at a conference and I saw a poster session on it. And I was like, ticks on lizards? And I just thought that was really fascinating because it was something that I never really thought of.
Well, because the history of Lyme disease, it was studied in the Northeast. It was first discovered in Lyme, Connecticut. And there aren't many lizards up here. I mean, occasionally you might get a fence lizard. On the New Jersey side, we had a lot of fence lizards. These ticks don't particularly like fence lizards. We didn't get many on them. It's very rare to get skinks up here. And we had a few skinks on Wisconsin side, and the ticks liked them, but it was a rare animal up there, very rare. So in the Northeast, you're used to mammals, and some studies have looked at birds. When you start getting to the South, though, there you find lots of ticks on the lizards. And there had been a few studies that had looked at that in the past, but we didn't know how representative they were of the whole geographical trend. So that's what was fostered this study. That and the problem that if physicians report lots of Lyme disease in the Northeast, plenty in Rhode Island. I'm right in the thick of it here, and in the northern Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, but very few reports in the South. And there were hypotheses, or one of the hypotheses for that was that, well, they're mostly on lizards in the South, but there was no strong evidence to support that. So we decided to wrote a proposal to do a study to actually set up sites north to south and actually look to see, was it host association? Was it the host-seeking behavior? Did that differ? People have known for years that if you take a drag cloth, there's a white cloth, and pull it through the woods in the north, you get tons of ticks on it. Do it in the south, you don't get them. We didn't know why. So that was another hypothesis. We looked at survival north to south, seasonal cycling north to south, all that stuff, and tried to do as broad a study as we could to try to figure out what were the factors that was influencing this difference in human incidence of Lyme disease, very common in the north and present, but less common in the south. So that was the origin of that study.
So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about what your research was with that, because I think it is very interesting. And like I said, there was several things in there that do relate back to tick behavior and stuff like that, we'll talk about more, I'm sure, as we go along. But let's go ahead and start.
Okay. Let's talk about what we found out from all those different hypotheses. One of the grad students at Michigan State, the lead scientist on this project was Jean Tsao. She's a professor at Michigan State University. And we had numerous institutions involved. And I was here, we had other people from the University of Rhode Island, herpetologist Russell Burke from Hofstra University, Graham Hickman from the University of Tennessee, Reza Biati from Georgia Southern University, Nick Ogden, who's with the Public Health Agency of Canada, who've done a lot of tick ecology and transmission research. And we wanted to look at this from as many angles as we could. So we started looking at differences in ticks north to south. And one of Jean Tsao's grad students, Isis Arsenault, her PhD work was looking at host-seeking behavior of northern versus southern ticks. So she took these ticks and set them up in Tennessee, northern southern, and she created what she called tick gardens. They were little kind of enclosures with, flashing with sticky foot so the ticks couldn't get out, and the leaf litter, little dowels there. She put northern ticks in some of them and southern ticks, just observed the behavior, times observations. And what you found was ticks from southern sites, you didn't see it. They stayed underneath the leaf litter surface. Ticks from northern sites, they climbed up on the little dowels to seek hosts. Well, of course, those are southern ticks moved north. Maybe they just didn't like it, So we repeated that experiment in Wisconsin, Rhode Island, Tennessee, and Florida. Northern ticks in some enclosures, southern ticks in others, and it was consistent. Wherever you put them, the northern ticks climbed up on top of the leaf litter, southern ticks stayed down under the leaf litter surface. So immediately that explains why when you take a drag cloth in the north, you get the ticks, they're all on the top of the leaves and on the twigs. In the south, they're underneath the leaf litter. You're not getting it where the ticks are. Mm-hmm. And of course, think about that human walking through the woods in the north, you get ticks all over you, but in the south, you don't. And I think that's, at least this is the nympho state we're talking about. I think that was the first big clue as to the answer to this question. And actually, Isis then did another experiment where she had people send her ticks from all around, and she raised them up and then put them into tick gardens and looked at their behavior and looked at how likely they were to climb up above the leaf litter. And she had a metric for that, and then compared that to the incidence of Lyme disease in the county where the ticks came from. And it was just a very good relationship. So that means that tick hosting behavior is related in a very strong way to whether people are exposed to Lyme disease or not.
Right. And when we're saying ticks in this instance, you're specifically talking about the blackleg
nymphal black-legged nymphal deer tick. Yeah, because that's the stage of transmission. If you look at where Lyme disease is common, the time of year when the nymphs are active, that's when most human cases occur. So it's the nymph that's most important, and that's the stage that displays. Adults are different. Adults are they seek hosts typically along animal trails, maybe 18 inches off the ground. They're mostly on deer, and so deer going through that trail. But if you go through an animal trail through the woods in the north in October, you'll get plenty of adults on you. But even in the south, adults will get on people, and they're in the same kind of environment. Mm-hmm. And in fact, some people think that most Lyme disease in the south comes from adult bites, just because the nymphs don't usually bite people, but the adults do, because the adults are up above the leaf litter surface. So that's that was one big north-south difference. We looked at differences in survival. And maybe ticks have survival patterns. So we took northern ticks and southern ticks, did this in the lab, and we looked at whether there's survival differences. And the interesting thing was whether the ticks came from the north or the south, they always lived longer under northern conditions.
Interesting.
Which is interesting. I mean, these ticks, they're ectothermic. They don't create their own body heat. So it's cooler in the north. Metabolism is slower. They just live slower, live longer, Mm-hmm. So we did another experiment where we looked at survival under different humidity conditions. And that was, the result was interesting. Under 95% humidity, ticks lived long, both northern and southern conditions, didn't matter. 85% humidity, that's about the threshold. Now, these ticks, they like humid conditions. It gets below about 80% humidity, they start losing water. At 85% humidity, there's a lot of variability, but still no big difference in survival in northern and southern conditions of temperature. But at 75% humidity, they always died faster under southern conditions of temperature. So when you have 75% humidity and southern warm temperatures, it creates a desiccating effect and it kills the ticks. So our hypothesis was that, in the south, since it's warmer, even though it's fairly humid, but to a tick has to be very humid for a tick to survive. So it's at below 80% humidity under southern conditions of temperature, it creates desiccation stress. So the ticks may evolve to stay below the leaf litter surface. You see? So that's a hypothesis. It's hard to prove that. But at least that may be one reason why the southern ticks aren't on the surface where they might encounter people.
So we keep saying north and south.
Yeah.
How are we dividing north and south? Because I know, like, I'm in Kentucky, and sometimes we've got more northern behavior, and sometimes our ecology is more like our southern neighbors. And I mean, same thing east and west. I mean, Kentucky's such a mixing zone.
I agree. And it's not a clear distinction. I mean, some of the when we looked at some of these aspects of tick biology, that we found north-south trends, we found east-west trends. So it's a complicated situation.
Mm-hmm.
Kentucky, you're about the latitude of Virginia, and we found that the biggest distinction happened at about that latitude. South of that was more southern type conditions. North of that was more northern. But that's a moving target. For example, I had talked previously about how these ticks had spread starting in the 1900s from coastal sites. That spread went west, it went north, and it went south. And there's evidence now in the last few years that these ticks have been moving south along the Blue Ridge Mountains down into Virginia, down into northeastern Tennessee. And that would also affect Kentucky, presumably. And those are northern type ticks that see coast above leaf litter, as far as we know. And in fact, Lyme disease cases have increased in that area. So there is that spread that's heading southward. But our recent study, looking at the host range, and we had sites in Virginia. We had the northern sites were Wisconsin, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. And then the southern sites were Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida, and Alabama. And, that area, the Tennessee, North Carolina area, was kind of a transition area. Mm-hmm. For example, the seasonal cycling of ticks in Tennessee were similar to the Northeast, which is kind of interesting. When you got south in South Carolina and Florida and Alabama, it was very different. I think that is a transition area. And there's not a lot of Lyme disease right now in Tennessee, in North Carolina, but that may change because of this spread. However, the question is, with climate change, as climate gets warmer, are those ticks going to act more like the southern ticks and stop seeking hosts for above the leaf litter? That might happen. We don't know yet. At least we know what to look for.
Right.
Now, the host relationships are also a part of this whole story. And that's what that recent paper was about, because that paper tried to pull all these different things together. In the Northeast, where Lyme disease was originally discovered, everybody looked at rodents as a primary host of the immature stages of the tick. Remember, the larvae hatch out from the eggs, typically not infected. That happens in late July, early August. And then they feed on mostly small mammals, but they'll feed on deer as well, and people, but mostly small mammals like mice and voles and shrews, all of which are very good hosts for the Lyme disease bacteria. So they feed on, they pick it up. Then they overwinter, emerge as nymphs the following spring, starting in late May, and they peak in June or early July. So here, about a quarter of these nymphs are infected. They had picked up the bacteria as larvae feeding the previous August. Now they're infected, and a lot of them bite people. And that's where most Lyme disease gets to people. A lot of them have bitten other hosts and picked up the bacteria so that they emerge as adults that fall, higher infection rate, but not as much exposure to people. So that seasonal cycle was very important. And that kind of changes as you go south, but it's not a clean change. It's very complex. So people thought about these ticks primarily in terms of adults fed on deer, but that doesn't play a role in the bacteria transition. But the immatures feeding on the mice and the voles and the shrews, that's where the transmission of the bacteria is occurring. The other interesting thing is, remember, the eggs hatch in midsummer. So those larvae, uninfected larvae, are feeding on these mice primarily in August. Those nymphs that were infected were out in June. So they're infecting the mice in June. And then when the uninfected larvae hatch in August, the mice are infected and they pick up the bacteria. It's a very efficient transmission cycle. That's why you get a quarter of the nymphs infected. And that, of course, breaks down when you get into the deep south. In the middle Atlantic states, it's still some of that happens. It's also different in the Western states. So the question was, what happens as you go south when, one hypothesis, well, when you get south, it's more diverse. There's more diversity of hosts. Certainly, there are a lot more lizards, a lot of other species. So does just species diversity play a role? Because if there's more diverse hosts, then you have a dilution type effect where there are fewer on the mice than you have in the north because they're diffused among lizards and other hosts. So we wanted to look at that as well. That's very important. So we set up those sample sites I talked about. And in each of those sites, we did very intensive samples. Each one we had 3 sampling arrays. Each one had a 7x7 array of mouse traps, each about a hectare, which is 100 yards by 100 yards, roughly. So we had 49 mouse traps. We had 4 traps for medium mammals like raccoons and possums. We had pitfall trap arrays. Each one had 5-gallon buckets, 5 of them sunk into the ground with drift fences. So any animal walking along the forest road would run into the drift fence, walk along the fence and fall into the bucket. We had cover boards, metal and wood cover boards, 20 pairs to get reptiles and some small mammals. We put up burlap skirts on trees, 20 of those at just a meter of burlap, and a lot of lizards like to hang out on there. So that way you lift them up and you catch lizards, get mice there. So we wanted to get our hands on everything on the forest floor. And for things we couldn't catch, we set up wildlife cameras that were motion activated cameras with an odor bait. And so any animal that came to that bait, the camera would take a picture. We wanted to get our hands on everything. So we did those samples at those 8 sites, and we set up. We had more than 20 sites total. We did other samples at some other sites, but those were the sites where we did comprehensive samples for 2 years. We did those samples every 3rd week throughout the season. And if you look at what animals the ticks were on, it was a very clear distinction. The northern sites, the ticks were predominantly on those small mammals. On mice, predominantly also on voles and shrews. Some on other mammals, larger mammals, very few on lizards. Even there were some areas where fence lizards were pretty common in the north. The New Jersey side, they didn't like the fence lizards. You go into the south, they're predominantly on lizards, and especially on skinks. In that paper that we published, we just compared lizards to mammals. But in fact, I'm now working on a paper now. We look at the different lizard species, and we find they like broad-headed skinks and 5-line skinks. That's a genus Plestiodon. That was their preferred lizard host. Not so many on fence lizards, not so many on animals, not so many on race runners. It's those Plestiodon skinks that they really liked, which was kind of interesting. And that was true in the southern state. Those lizards were much more common in all the southern states. But it was a fairly clear distinction when you got south of Virginia. But again, I think that's a fuzzy line. It's not a clear. Right. But if you look at infection rate of ticks with bacteria, they're very high in the northern sites, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Wisconsin, high infection rates in the ticks. In the south, very low infection rates, less than 1% infected. And presumably that relates to the fact that the mice are very good hosts for the bacteria. So an uninfected tick feeding on a mouse has a very high probability of picking up the bacteria, whereas the lizards are much poorer hosts. The highest I've seen for infection, there was one study looking at skinks and found about 20-some-odd% of the ticks fed on an infected skink picked it up. But we've done studies and found 0%. So it's much less effective at transmitting the bacteria than ticks in the north. And so the infection in ticks in the north is much higher than in the south. So that means in the south, there are infected ticks there, and we found some, but the probability of being exposed to Lyme disease is much lower because the primary stage that transmits the bacteria doesn't bite people because it's below the leaf litter. And if you are bitten, the infection rate is much lower because they're feeding predominantly on lizards, mostly skinks, and they are much less effective than mice are at harboring the spirochete. In the South, we found, even when there were lots of mice, if there were mice and lizards, they fed predominantly on the skinks, not on the mice. It wasn't just dilution; it was an actual selective attachment to lizards rather than mice.
Do we know why they're preferring skinks down south?
Yeah, that's a good question. It could be something ecological. It could be that the skinks happen to be in just the right habitat at the same time the ticks are seeking hosts there. So it may not, maybe if you gave them a choice in the lab, they'd pick them equally, but it's not at all clear. The one study that actually tried to do that compared nymphs, and what it did is it set them up. This was done in Georgia Southern University. They had a mouse here and a lizard there, and they had a little bridge, and they put the ticks in the middle. And when they did, the nymphs didn't show any preference. The problem with that is that that's not how these ticks normally seek hosts. These ticks typically find a place where they're going to seek hosts, and they just wait there for a host to brush by. So it may be instructive, but it's not clear that's true. We have actually done some studies, which we're just writing up now, publication, looking at that, and we do find a north-south trend. This was done out in outdoor enclosure, so it's more natural environment there. Southern ticks did seem to like lizards more than mice, more than northern ticks, but that's not published yet. So let's see what the peer reviewers say.
Right. Yeah, I'm going to be looking forward to that because that's going to be interesting.
Yeah, but the paper that was published did the samples exactly the same way everywhere, so there's no bias in sampling. And when you had lots of mice in the north, the ticks were all on the mice. When you had lots of mice in the south and also lots of skinks, the ticks were on the skinks, not the mice. So there's clear selective attachment. Or whether it's an actual preference or just something ecological, the microhabitat or the day that they were seeking hosts, something like that. We don't know, and we haven't done the experiments to distinguish that.
Yeah, I kind of guessed we don't know yet it was going to be the answer, but that's just it's just one of those questions that I've got to ask. Why? Because it's just so interesting.
It's interesting. It's also a difficult question to answer.
Yeah.
About what you have to do to answer that question. But yeah.
Yeah. Why is always the most difficult question to ask and to answer? Well, easy to ask, harder to answer.
The overall conclusion of this big study is the primary reasons why Lyme disease is much more common in the north than in the south is ticks are more likely to bite people in the north because they're seek hosts above the leaf litter, and B, the ticks are a much higher proportion of them are infected in the north because they feed on hosts that are better at transmitting the bacterium. Mm-hmm. So the short answer to the question.
Which, I think that's really interesting there because of the behavioral changes with the ticks themselves, as far as where they're located, because of their risk of exposure for the nymphal deer ticks.
Right.
And just how that all interplays with their disease transmission to us as humans. I think that's very interesting, and how that does change from more northern states to more southern states. And then again, you brought up the questions. What's climate change going to do with all this? Or as the northern ticks come down south along the Appalachians, how's that going to change, and how this is all going to play out?
And the problem is there are a lot of things that play into that. There is one, the distribution of hosts. Will skinks become more common in the mid-Atlantic states than they are currently? If they do, they may become more of an important tick host, and so infection rates might go down, but it's not clear. Remember, the northern style ticks are still spreading, north, west, and south. Mm-hmm. So at least temporarily, we may get more Lyme disease in the southern states. In fact, recent reports from North Carolina have shown evidence of more transmission. So I think that may, at least over the short term, that may be the case. But is climate change going to change that by A, putting pressure on those ticks in the mid-Atlantic states to start acting more like southern ticks, and B, resulting in increased populations of skinks and other hosts that are not good reservoirs? That it could be, it remains to be seen.
Yes.
It certainly We do expect Lyme disease to spread more northward into Canada. That's already happening. There have been a few papers that have looked at effects of climate change on ticks and tick-borne diseases, tick-borne pathogens, and they all say that, the evidence suggests kind of that the band of where these diseases are will tend to move towards the more poleward, and I think that's probably true. And there is evidence now of increasing Lyme disease in Canada, southern Canada at least. But the ecological reasons for that, the things that affect the transmission dynamics can be very complicated, as we explained.
Mm-hmm. And you said also things are also spreading west. Are we seeing more of a westward expansion then of Lyme disease, or is that
areas of Pennsylvania, yes, and Western New York? There is evidence of that. There are some people who think that part of the problem was there hasn't been enough sampling in the interim region between the northern Midwest and the Northeast, and I mean that might play a role. But I think in general there is evidence of westward spread, yes. And if you go to the northern Midwest, there's evidence of spread. For example, traditional area of large amounts of Lyme disease in the northern Midwest is in Minnesota, Wisconsin area, the place where those two states come together. There's now evidence of spread into Michigan and spreading up the eastern shore of Lake Michigan and also into Michigan proper. So there is evidence that these ticks are spreading, and presumably those historical environmental changes that I've talked about, increasing deer populations and increasing appropriate habitat, play into that. But climate change likely contributes as well. Those papers that have tried to review this climate change all say that that's likely to happen, but they all say it's so complicated that it's hard to make strong predictions.
Right. Well, are there ways that homeowners or those of us who just love to be outside can really apply some of this to maybe decrease our risks of exposure?
Well, yeah, there are. There are many ways. And first, I want to point out a few very good resources. One, if you go to the CDC website, the cdc.gov, they have a whole section about ticks, about how to protect yourself from ticks. It's excellent. There are also several websites that are out of universities and other places and research centers that are excellent. And you can just Google ticks, you can find many of those. There's a tick management handbook that was published by the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station. It applies mostly to ticks in the Northeast, but it has a lot of information about how to protect yourself and how to manage your property to avoid ticks. I can hit the highlights.
Okay.
First of all, the one thing that works everywhere is self-protection. You protect yourself against ticks. So if you're going to an area where there's a likelihood of tick exposure, certainly in the summer in the Northeast, a lot of things will help you. When I do tick work, I always wear light colored clothing because the ticks, you can see them on the light background. So tuck my pants into my socks because the ticks, again, they're mostly the black-legged ticks are mostly near the ground level. So they get on your shoes and they walk up your leg. Some people don't want to do that, especially if they're in shorts, but check yourself every few minutes or so. If you have a buddy, check your back. That's great. I mean, if someone who does tick work, you tend to be very conscientious, and most people, if they're out having fun, aren't going to do that. But when you get home at the end of the day, check yourself thoroughly, and that I very strongly recommend, because Lyme disease, a tick has to be attached between 1 or 2 days to transmit Lyme disease bacterium. It's a long time of attachment. Those bacteria are in the gut of the tick when it's flat, and when it starts feeding, they start replicating and then go throughout the tick, and eventually after a day or two, they get into the salivary glands, and that's when they're transmitted. So if you are out all day, then you get home, you take a shower, you check yourself thoroughly, you feel around. If you feel something that clicks, your fingernail clicks on, that's probably a tick. Remove it then. The chance of getting Lyme disease are very small because it takes typically more than a day to transmit. That's my strongest recommendation. And the way to remove a tick is very simple. You get very fine tweezers, very fine point tweezers. Grab the tick as close to the skin line as you can. You want to get the mouth parts of the tick. You don't want to squeeze it into you, and just slowly pull it straight out. I mean, it might pull your skin up a little bit. They have these little recurved spines and they secrete a little cement to hold them in place. But if you pull it straight out, you'll get them out cleanly. And that is my strongest recommendation. Now, there are a lot of repellents that work very well. You put the repellents on your shoes and your pants, they will repel ticks. Repellents with picaridin work well, DEET, 20 or 30% DEET. There are a whole bunch of approved repellents. For ticks, you don't really have to use them on your skin, so unless you're wearing, shorts, then you might want to use those. Some people use permethrin. There are permethrin repellents. Those are not to be used on your skin, but you can use them on your clothes. Like you can buy clothes that are pre-treated with them if you want, and they're very effective. The permethrin treatments, they're less of a repellent than a toxicant. The tick gets on your pant and drops dead. And so those are a lot of these top spot things that you get on dogs. They don't use permethrin. They use other toxicants you can get for your pets. And their collars and their top spot products that when the tick gets on your pet, the toxin kills them. I had a dog in Rhode Island with lots of ticks, and occasionally we'd get up off the bed, its bed, and there would be dead ticks there. And these products are quite effective, according to the label. So that you don't want to use that. That's fine, but if that's okay with you, and you're going to known tick areas, these are very effective approaches as well. I still would check myself at the end of the day, not 100%. But
yes, definitely. I mean, tick checks for me are just normal because, well, I've always spent so much time outside, and I always wear long jeans because of that.
You're in dog tick and Lone Star tick territory, and Lone Star ticks are very aggressive. How I talked about deer ticks being, the ones that sit and wait for a host to brush by. Lone Star ticks do that, but they also will chase you down. They are very aggressive. I did a study once where I was on Fire Island, where both species were present, where I took, drags, we just drag ticks, but I also put tick traps out. Tick trap is a little, device with beveled sides with some tape on top, so the tick going over the bevels, I get stuck on the tape. And you put some dry ice in there. When the carbon dioxide at least attracts the ticks, they come up and they get caught on the tape. Well, when you take a drag sample, you get lots of deer ticks and lots of Lone Star ticks. You put out tick traps, you get lots of Lone Star ticks, almost no deer ticks, because the deer ticks stay put and the Lone Star ticks move around. So this is great. So I ran tick races. I made a little dot with a circle around. I put the tick of each species in the middle. I saw which one left the circle first. And of course, the Lone Star ticks were the big winners on the tick races. So so where you are and all throughout the South, and now increasingly in the North, Lone Star ticks are very, very aggressive, and you easily get large numbers of them on you. And now here, this is yet another use for duct tape. Everyone likes to use duct tape. Duct tape is very sticky, and it's very good at getting ticks off you. And not when they're attached, but if they're crawling around. So if you go out in the field and you get, go into an area, you have lots of the Lone Star ticks crawling around on you, take some duct tape, a sticky part outside it, and just pick them off, get them off very quickly that way. Anyone who does field work with ticks has duct tape with them for that reason.
Oh yes, duct tape is awesome especially when they're in that nymphal stage or the what I call the walking freckle stage.
Yeah. Well, with Lone Star ticks, they lay lots of eggs as well, and you might have a little patch. They all hatch, and they're the larvae all in one spot. And sometimes they're on the ground, sometimes they'll be on a leaf at the edge of a bush. You brush along that, and there's a little spot on your pants with 200 larval ticks there. Yep. And then that spot starts expanding as they move out. That's when you need the duct tape. You get it off very quickly with the duct tape at that point.
Yep, been there, done that more than once.
So you know all about that, right? Fortunately, larval and nymphal American dog ticks don't bite people. It's only the adults that bite people.
Okay.
So those are large. They're out mostly in spring as well, and summer. So they will be. They're large enough to see.
Yeah.
Duct tape is good for Lone Star ticks and for black-legged ticks as well. By the way, all these other pathogens they also take a while, hours at least. The one exception is the Powassan virus, the deer virus, which can be transmitted very quickly, 15 minutes or so. But that's unfortunately very, very rare. Anywhere from 5 to 50 cases nationwide in a year, very, very low numbers.
Okay. Well, this has been very interesting and educational. Thanks so much for being here. I mean, I love it when I get to learn something new and also get to share it with our listeners as well. If people have additional questions or want to keep up with the research, can they contact you?
Sure. If you go to the Eastern Ecological Science Center website, you can find my contact information there. But again, there are online sources for information.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we can get a lot of information on the CDC website, and just Googling, use any search engine, look for tick information or Lyme disease and ticks. There are a lot of websites that are available that give excellent information, including some that will give you ideas all around the country of what your exposure is at any given time of year. So there's one in the Northeast, there's one in the Northern Midwest, a lot of information like that that's available if you look for it.
Okay. Yeah. And I will have links in the show notes for this episode to your USGS profile page so people can see more about the research you're doing. And if they want to contact you, your information's there, but also for some of these other resources that we've been talking about. And of course, to the paper that you just published as well with your colleagues that talks more in depth about all these different hypotheses and then how you've kind of boiled them down and the conclusions for kind of answering that question. Why is Lyme disease more prevalent in the North than it is in the South? So that's a good place to look for any of our listeners who are really interested in this and want to learn more. I'd suggest starting with the show notes. And then, like you said, if you want to go even deeper, there's lots of information out there. But yeah, so thanks again for talking with us today and hope you have a great day.
You too. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye. I appreciate Howie taking the time to talk with us. Ticks aren't my favorite organism by any stretch of the imagination, but I do find it fascinating that they can use so many different types of hosts. I could have spent quite a bit more time than we did diving into just that one piece of the conversation alone, because, like I said, I always think of ticks as being on mammals, not birds or reptiles. I've also always been drawn to animal behavior of any type, so the regional differences related to where the immature ticks hang out and their host-seeking behaviors is equally fascinating to me. I think it is very interesting how all of these pieces of the puzzle work together to create different risks for catching Lyme disease in various parts of the country. And as people who are interested in nature and presumably spend quite a bit of time outside, I think it is important that we are all aware of our risk factors for tick-borne diseases. Part of that obviously comes down to just knowing what types of ticks are common where you are located, because different types of ticks carry different types of diseases. But as the current research shows, there's more to it than just that. Before I wrap this up, I want to ask a favor of you. If you find value in the Backyard Ecology content, please consider joining our community of supporters. There are many ways you can support Backyard Ecology, both financially and non-financially. Learn more at www.backyardecology.net/join-us. Until next week, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yard and community.